The tension did not erupt overnight. It had been building quietly, whispered in hallways, debated in small groups, and discussed behind closed doors long before it ever reached a microphone or a camera. When members of New Birth Church began openly demanding Jamal Bryant's resignation, many outsiders treated it as sudden rebellion. For those inside the congregation, it felt more like an inevitable breaking point. Years of unresolved concerns, unanswered questions, and emotional fatigue had finally reached a moment where silence no longer felt faithful. What made this moment different was not anger, but resolve. The voices calling for resignation were not fringe critics or distant commentators. They were members who had served, given, prayed, and stayed through multiple seasons. People who once defended leadership now spoke with visible disappointment. Their language was careful but firm. This was not about rumor, it was about trust, and whether that trust could still be sustained. At the heart of their demand was a feeling many described as exhaustion. Exhaustion from constant controversy, exhaustion from feeling unheard, exhaustion from having to explain to friends and family why the church was always in the news for the wrong reasons. For some members, loyalty had slowly turned into obligation, and obligation into resentment. That shift did not happen all at once. It happened one unresolved issue at a time. Several members emphasized that their call for resignation was not rooted in hatred or vengeance. It was framed as accountability. They argued that leadership carries responsibility not only for vision, but for stability. When a leader becomes a source of repeated distraction, they said, the mission suffers. Worship becomes overshadowed by explanation. Outreach becomes secondary to damage control. The church, they felt, was losing focus. Others spoke about a deeper emotional toll. They described feeling spiritually conflicted, torn between honoring leadership and honoring their own convictions. Some admitted they had stayed quiet longer than they should have out of fear of being labeled disloyal. But silence, they said, had begun to feel like complicity. Speaking out became an act of conscience rather than rebellion. Not everyone agreed. Many members continued to support Jamal Bryant, pointing to his preaching, activism, and impact beyond the church walls. They warned against making decisions based on pressure rather than prayer. They argued that leadership is rarely perfect and that perseverance through difficulty is part of faith. This divide exposed a congregation wrestling not just with a leader, but with differing understandings of accountability itself. The demand for resignation also raised questions about governance. Who decides when a leader should step aside? Is it the board, the congregation, or the leader themselves? Members asking for resignation said they felt excluded from meaningful decision-making. That exclusion, they argued, contributed to the current crisis. When communication breaks down, trust follows. Some members recalled earlier moments when concerns were raised privately, only to be dismissed or delayed. Over time, that pattern eroded confidence. By the time demands became public, many felt they had exhausted internal avenues. Going public was not their first choice. It was their last. Outside observers often reduce such moments to power struggles. Inside the church, it felt more personal. People described sleepless nights, strained friendships, and the pain of watching a spiritual home fracture. This was not a protest staged for attention. It was a plea for clarity, direction, and healing. The language used by members was telling. They did not say destroy, they did not say cancel. They said resign, step aside, create space. To them, resignation was not punishment but an opportunity for reset, a chance for church to breathe, recalibrate, and refocus on its core mission without constant controversy. Critics of the demand warned that resignation would not solve deeper issues. They argued that removing one person would not automatically heal systemic problems. Supporters of resignation countered that leadership sets tone, and tone shapes culture. Without change at the top, they believed meaningful reform would remain impossible. What became undeniable was that the situation had moved beyond disagreement into crisis. Trust, once fractured, is difficult to restore without decisive action. Members demanding resignation were not asking for perfection. They were asking for accountability that matched the weight of leadership. As the story spread, public attention intensified. Media coverage amplified emotions, sometimes flattening nuance. But inside the church, the question remained painfully simple. Can this congregation move forward under the same leadership? Or has the moment arrived for transition? For many members, the answer had become clear. Continuing as before felt unsustainable. Whether Jamal Bryant would step aside was uncertain. What was certain was that a significant portion of the congregation no longer felt at peace remaining silent. Their demand was not just about a leader. It was about reclaiming a sense of spiritual integrity they felt had been compromised. This moment marked a crossroads. One path led toward continued tension, explanation, and division. The other toward change, uncertainty, and the possibility of renewal. Neither path was easy, but for those demanding resignation, doing nothing felt like the hardest choice of all. As the internal pressure intensified, the emotional divide within New Birth Church became impossible to ignore. Longtime members described a growing sense of grief, not just frustration. Grief for what the church once represented to them. Grief for relationships strained by disagreement. Grief for the idea that a place built on healing had become a source of anxiety. This emotional weight gave the resignation demand a tone that outsiders often missed. It was not loud, it was heavy. Some members explained that their breaking point came during services themselves. They described moments when sermons felt overshadowed by unspoken tension in the room. Instead of feeling spiritually renewed, they felt distracted, scanning faces, wondering who else was questioning the same things they were. For them, worship had become complicated, layered with concern rather than clarity. That shift deeply troubled people who had relied on the church as a place of refuge. Others pointed to the constant cycle of explanation. Explaining to visitors why controversy followed the church, explaining to their children why adults were arguing, explaining to themselves why they were still staying. Over time, explanation became exhausting. Members said they did not join a church to manage narratives. They joined to grow, serve, and belong. The call for resignation also reflected a desire for transparency. Several members said they felt information was filtered, delayed, or framed in ways that minimized their concerns. This perception, whether accurate or not, eroded trust further. When people feel decisions are being made without them, they often respond by asserting their voice more forcefully. The resignation demand was, in part, an attempt to reclaim agency. Supporters of Jamal Bryant pushed back strongly against that interpretation. They argued that leadership decisions are complex and cannot always be shared publicly. They warned that public pressure could undermine the church's autonomy and invite unnecessary scrutiny. From their perspective, the resignation demand risked turning internal disagreement into spectacle. This disagreement revealed a deeper question about authority. In faith communities, authority is often understood as both spiritual and organizational. When those dimensions fall out of alignment, conflict follows. Members demanding resignation felt spiritual authority had been weakened by ongoing turmoil. Supporters felt organizational authority was being challenged improperly. Both sides believed they were protecting the church. The tension also exposed generational differences. Younger members tended to emphasize accountability, transparency, and emotional health. Older members often emphasize loyalty, patience, and perseverance. These values are not inherently opposed, but when placed under stress, they can clash. The resignation demand became a focal point for these differing priorities. Several members spoke about fear of division, fear of losing friendships, fear of being judged for speaking out. This fear kept many silent longer than they wanted. When they finally spoke, it was not because fear disappeared, but because staying silent felt more damaging than the risk of conflict. That shift marked a turning point. Others expressed concern about precedent. If a leader resigns under pressure, what message does that send? Does it empower accountability or encourage instability? Members were not asking these questions hypothetically. They were wrestling with real consequences for their community. The lack of clear answers fueled uncertainty. What complicated matters further was the presence of external voices. Media coverage and online commentary amplified internal debates, sometimes distorting them. Members felt their concerns were being simplified into soundbites. Supporters felt their loyalty was being framed as blind allegiance. Both felt misunderstood. This external pressure intensified internal strain. Despite these challenges, some members saw hope in the conflict itself. They believed that honest disagreement, though painful, could lead to healthier structures. They argued that avoiding conflict had allowed issues to fester. Confronting them, even messily, might open the door to reform. For these members, the resignation demand was not an end, but a catalyst. Others remained deeply conflicted. They loved their church. They respected Jamal Bryant's gifts. They were troubled by the turmoil. They felt caught between gratitude and concern. For them, the demand for resignation felt too final, too irreversible. They feared it would fracture the community beyond repair. This emotional complexity made it difficult to find common ground. Conversations often stalled not because people lacked faith, but because they held different visions of what faithfulness required in this moment. Was faithfulness staying and trusting leadership? Or was it speaking out and demanding change? Both answers felt sincere. What united nearly everyone was a desire for peace. Not superficial calm, but genuine stability. Members wanted to attend church without bracing themselves. They wanted to serve without feeling conflicted. They wanted to focus on mission rather than management. The disagreement lay in how to achieve that peace. As meetings continued and discussions grew more intense, it became clear that the church stood at a crossroads. Continuing without addressing the resignation demand risked deepening resentment. Forcing a resignation risked alienating loyal supporters. Either path carried loss. The absence of an easy solution weighed heavily on the congregation. In this atmosphere, members demanding resignation continued to emphasize that their goal was healing, not humiliation. They insisted that stepping aside could be an act of leadership rather than defeat. Whether that perspective would be embraced remained uncertain. What was certain was that the conversation could no longer be ignored. As the situation moved toward its most critical phase, what emerged was not just a leadership crisis, but a test of identity for New Birth Church itself. Members began asking a question deeper than resignation. Who are we becoming in the middle of this conflict? For some, the demand for Jamal Bryant's resignation symbolized a desire to reclaim the church's soul. For others, it felt like a threat to its unity. That divide was no longer theoretical. It was shaping daily interactions, attendance, and participation. Some members described feeling emotionally split every Sunday, sitting in the same sanctuary with people they loved, yet sensing an unspoken rift. Smiles felt strained, conversations felt cautious. Longtime friends avoided certain topics to keep the peace. This emotional restraint, over time, became another source of fatigue. Church, which once offered release, now required emotional management. Leaders within smaller ministries faced difficult choices. Do they encourage open discussion and risk inflaming tensions, or do they urge silence and risk suppressing legitimate concerns? Many felt unprepared for the weight of that responsibility. They were volunteers, not crisis managers. Yet the conflict demanded skills beyond what most had expected when they first agreed to serve. Members demanding resignation continued to stress that their stance was rooted in hope, not despair. They spoke about the possibility of renewal through transition. They referenced other churches that had experienced painful leadership changes but emerged stronger with clearer governance and healthier culture. For them, resignation was not an admission of failure, but an opportunity for reset. Supporters of Jamal Bryant remained equally passionate. They warned that conceding to public pressure could erode confidence in leadership across the board. If a vocal group could force resignation, what would prevent future instability? They argued that endurance through difficulty, not retreat, demonstrated faith. To them, standing with leadership during controversy was an act of spiritual maturity. This clash of values made compromise difficult. Both sides believed they were protecting the church's future. Both invoked faith, integrity, and responsibility. Yet their conclusions diverged sharply. Without a shared framework for decision-making, discussions often circled without resolution. Some members proposed mediation or facilitated dialogue as an alternative to resignation. They suggested bringing in neutral advisors to help the congregation process its conflict constructively. Others felt that such measures would only delay the inevitable. The longer the issue remained unresolved, they argued, the deeper the wounds would grow. Amid these debates, quieter voices often went unheard. Members who felt confused, conflicted, or simply tired, those who did not want to take sides but wanted peace. They worried that any outcome would leave scars. That concern added another layer of urgency. Delay felt harmful. Action felt risky. The board's role became a focal point of attention. Members demanded clarity about governance, accountability, and process. Silence from leadership bodies only intensified suspicion. Transparency, many argued, was now as important as theology. Without it, trust could not be rebuilt regardless of who remained in leadership. What made this moment especially painful was the shared history. This was not a congregation divided by strangers. These were people who had worshiped together, served together, mourned together. The idea that leadership conflict could fracture those bonds felt devastating, yet pretending everything was fine felt equally destructive. As discussions continued, some members chose to leave quietly rather than wait for resolution. Their departures, often unnoticed publicly, spoke volumes internally. Each empty seat represented a person who had lost hope that the situation would change. For those remaining, these departures intensified the sense that time was running out. Members demanding resignation began framing their stance less as opposition and more as urgency. Urgency to stop bleeding, urgency to prevent further damage, urgency to choose a path, even a difficult one, rather than remain stuck in limbo. In their view, indecision had become the most harmful option. Supporters of Jamal Bryant countered that urgency can cloud discernment. They urged patience, prayer, and perspective. They reminded the congregation that moments of crisis often feel larger than they are. Yet even among supporters, Some acknowledged that the ongoing tension was unsustainable. What united nearly everyone was a longing for resolution, even if they disagreed on its form. Members wanted to move forward. They wanted clarity. They wanted to know whether New Birth Church could heal without fundamental change, or whether change was now unavoidable. As the demand for resignation remained unresolved, the church stood at a defining moment. Whatever decision emerged would shape not just leadership, but culture. It would signal how the congregation handles conflict, accountability, and authority in the future. That weight was felt by everyone, regardless of stance. In the end, the call for Jamal Bryant's resignation was about more than one leader. It was about a community wrestling with its values under pressure, whether through resignation, reform, or reconciliation. New Birth Church was being forced to confront who it wanted to be. That confrontation, painful as it was, carried the possibility of growth. The outcome remained uncertain. But one truth was undeniable. The silence that once held the congregation together had broken. In its place stood a difficult, necessary conversation that would define the next chapter of the church's story.